Okay, so well, good afternoon and welcome everybody. And before anything else, we want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah and the Department of Linguistics recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous people and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, state, and the federal government, and we affirm that the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native Nation and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Okay, so let me now introduce today's speaker. Dr. Karlos Arregi is a fellow of the Linguistic Society of America and professor at the University of Chicago, where he has been teaching since 2008. After a BA in English philology at the University of Deusto in the Basque Country, he obtained his PhD at MIT in 2002 with a thesis discussing the interaction between syntactic structure and PF interface in the realization of focus in Basque, appropriately titled Focus on Basque Movement. Dr. Arregi's research interests are in syntax, morphology, and their interfaces with phonology and semantics. A central question in his work, is the extent to which grammatical properties of linguistic expressions can be explained in terms of syntax or in terms of principle that regulates the interface of syntax with other models of grammar. His research tries to illuminate this aspect of linguistic theory by drawing data mostly from Basque and Spanish, as well as other languages such as Washo, and I believe Breton in today's talk. Specific topics Dr. Arregi has worked on include syntactic and post-syntactic word formation, agreement and case, clitics, ellipsis, the syntax and phonology of stress, and switch reference. He co-authored the book Basque Morphotactics with Andrew Nevins, and he published on all major journals in the field, book chapters, and presented in all major conferences, including two in Salt Lake City. As for today's event, he will give a talk titled Head Movement as a Syntactic Operation. A couple of logistic information. As usual, after the talk, we are going to have a Q&A period. And at 4:30, we will be asking the faculty to leave the meeting so that we students can have a more informal meeting until around 5 p.m. And of course, all the students are encouraged to stay online. And so in passing him the floor, please join me in welcoming Dr. Arregi to our department and to our colloquium series.
Well, thank you, Mateo, for the nice introduction, and thank you everybody for inviting me to give this talk. Let me first share my screen. I hope everybody can see that.
Yeah, it looks good.
All right. So, okay, all right. So the topic of today's talk is head movement, right? And in particular, a defense of a view of head movement as a syntactic operation on its own, different from other syntactic operations, right? So first, a brief introduction to head movement, especially from my point of view, how we recognize it and how we distinguish it from other things, right? So initially, we can look at canonical instances of head movements, such as subject auxiliary inversion, in one in English, right? We'll left eat the cookies. And we see that there are at least two respects in which is different from other cases of movement, in particular phrasal movement, as in movement of in the passive to subject position in two, the cookies will be eaten, where the cookies moves to subject position from the VIP internal position, right? So the most obvious difference between the two is, of course, that head movement displaces heads or terminals, right? Or words, if you like. Whereas phrasal movement, you'll see there's good evidence that so-called phrasal movement can also displace heads. So in the passive example, in two, what moves is the cookies, right? The whole phrase, the whole subject phrase. All All right, but another important difference, and I think this is crucial and often underappreciated, is the fact that head movement has a very strict locality condition, and that is that it cannot skip intervening heads between the initial launch inside and the target. And this is what's called the head movement constraint, right? And that's what explains why when you invert a verb with the subject, as in one, right, we left the cookies, what moves is will. It cannot be any other verbal head. It cannot be eat. So you cannot have three eat lefty will the cookies, right? That's the head movement constraint that basically says when you move ahead to another head position, you cannot skip intervening heads. So here, eat is moving to the close initial position, skipping that head position of will. But on the other hand, phrasal movement is not super local in this sense. It's not subject to the head movement constraint. And of course, phrasal movement can skip any heads it needs to, right? Its locality conditions are just different. And in particular, sorry, we should say the cookies in two, right? Here, the cookies, this movement skipped at least three heads, represented here by will, be, and eaten. Right. So what is head movement? How do we deal with the fact that it, at least on the surface, looks different from phrasal movement, right? So in minimalism, which is the kind of theory I adopt, phrasal movement is formalized as move or internal merge. They're just different names for the same thing. I'm going to use I prefer to use move, but it doesn't matter. So, and you know, there's been lots of work on how move or internal merge works, and it's relatively well understood. But the question is, what's head movement? Right? So there surprisingly, there's been many theories of that, of how of what head movement is and how to derive it. As sort of a default theory, I think, that is assumed by most syntacticians working in minimalism, is that it's really the same kind of movement, the same kind of operation as phrasal movement. That is, it's move or internal merge. It's the same operation that derives phrasal movement, also derives head movement. And of course, the work there is to then explain why it looks different, right? There is, of course, another tag that says that is different from phrasal movement, and it is not even syntax. It occurs post-syntactically in the mapping to PF. And then yet another position is to say that it doesn't exist, right? That what looks like head movement is really something else is going on altogether in the derivation. All right, so the kind of approach that I've been defending for the last few years, in particular in work joined with Asha Petrashko, is that head movement is a syntactic operation on its own, is different from other syntactic operations, and in particular is different from move or internal merge. So we're taking the same kind of approach as the second one described here, except that we claim that it's just a syntactic operation, but it's still different from move. And so today I'm going to be presenting two kinds of arguments for this position. One has to do with the detailed investigations of certain properties of what appears to be a third kind of movement, which is long head movement, and in particular, a long verb movement in Breton. And what I'll argue is that when you look at the properties of this movement, you'll see that it calls for a distinction between the kind of super local head movement that I started the talk with and move or phrasal movement. So that will be the first argument. The second argument has to do with we'll see it's closely related to the first one, but it's a separate argument that shows that in remnant movement configurations, head movement does not behave as predicted if it were derived by move. All right. So most of the talk will be about the study of long head movement in Breton and the argument based on remnant movement configurations will come at the end. All right. So here is long head movement in Breton. It's illustrated in 4, right? And basically, very roughly, Breton is roughly a BSO language. Sorry, it's a language in which you always have something, at least in matrix clauses, you have some initial element, and that initial element can be the main verb. And it can be the main verb even in the presence of an auxiliary, right? Right. So what you see in 4 is that the main verb has been displaced across the auxiliary to a clause initial position. And that's why it's called long head movement, because it's movement that specifically affects a head, in this case, the verb, and it moves it to a clause initial position, skipping intervening heads. So it's not super local in the sense that we saw that other kinds of head movement are, like subject auxiliary inversion in English. So the puzzle about long head movement is that it just doesn't fit well in the typology of movements that I started to talk with, which is head movement versus phrasal movement, right? We saw that head movement is local and it affects heads, right? Local in the sense that it obeys the super local, right? It obeys the head movement constraint. And on the other hand, phrasal movement affects phrases and is not local, right? It doesn't obey the head movement constraint. But then long head movement seems to have a mixture of the properties because it affects, specifically affects a head, and it's not local. It can skip intervening heads. All right, so what previous theories have done with long head movement in Breton and other instances of head movement is basically say that at least this kind of head movement is really phrasal movement in the sense that it's derived by the same operation that derives phrasal movement, that is move or internal merge. So what I'm going to present here is a new kind of parallel between long head movement and phrasal movement that argues for this position. We'll see that when you look at the details of long head movement, this kind of verbal fronting in Breton has the same spell out possibilities as VP fronting in other languages. We'll see what I mean by spell out possibilities. We'll see that the surface result of long head movement can vary a lot depending on clause type and depending on the specific verb. And when we look at that kind of variation, we'll see that you find the same kind of variation in VP fronting that is in phrasal movement. And that is the argument that long head movement should be like phrasal movement. Now, the theoretical upshot of that is that it is not, unlike previous work, I don't see this actually as an argument to conflate all kinds of movement into one. It's just an argument to conflate long head movement with phrasal movement and still keep the more canonical kind of head movement as a separate thing. Right? So that in the end, that will be an argument that head movement, superlocal head movement that obeys the head movement constraint is not derived by move or internal merge. It's a separate operation. All right. So what do I mean by spell out possibilities of long V fronting or long verb movement in Breton? Well, first, take a look at what happens when you front VPs cross-linguistically, and we see 3 kinds of patterns. What I'm calling here the simple, doubling, and do support pattern. So very schematically, as presented here, one possibility is that when you front a VP, that's it, okay? You just take a VP that is at the right edge of the clause and you just put it at the beginning. That's it. But then often also what you find is verb doubling. That is, not only do you front the VP, but there is an extra copy of the VP, of the verb at the end of the clause, right? Roughly where the VP started. And then yet another possibility is looks like doubling, except that the verb that you find that is not part of the fronted VP is not a copy of the verb that was fronted, but actually the verb do, however the verb do is pronounced in the particular language. And as we'll see later, V fronting actually has, in Breton, has the 3 possibilities too. So let me illustrate first with VP fronting, right? So VP fronting, the kind of simple VP fronting I was talking about can be illustrated with Danish in 5. It could also be illustrated with English, but just wanted to give another language here. So this sentence is something like, hitting it particularly well, I don't think they have, right? So you have this VP that started as the complement of have, and you front it, and there's only one copy of the verb hidden, that it's here. Okay. All right. So this is sort of unremarkable, right? You move something and that's it. But what's interesting is that in some languages, I'm sorry, one more thing to say is that normally this kind of VP fronting occurs when you're fronting a VP in a compound tense, right? In this case, you know, the perfect, where you have an auxiliary have and the main verb that is a past participle. Normally you get this simple fronting. Under doubling, illustrated here with Polish in 6, not only do you front the VP, in this case, what's the game? What's left behind is another copy of the verb, in this case, watch. Okay, and you'll notice too that the inflectional form of the verb is different. The unfronted verb, the unfronted copy, has the expected inflection, in this case, first person singular in the past. But the one that is included in the fronted VP is in a sort of a default infinitival form. Okay. And then finally, we have do support. So in English, in simple tenses, when you front VPs, you front them, and you get things like, what's the game I did? The important thing is that now, in addition to this, to the verb in the infinitival form or bare form in the fronted VP, then you find an extra verb, in this case, do. And do actually has the inflection that we would expect on the verb, right? In this case, past tense. Okay. So these are relatively well-known facts. You have this variation in the way VP fronting is realized, right? Sometimes you get doubling of the verb, sometimes you get do support, sometimes you get nothing. So it turns out that Breton VP fronting works the same way, right? So in simple tenses, when you front, when you do long verb movement, when you front the verb on its own, you don't get any extra copy of the verb or do or anything like that. And this happens in compound tenses, just like we saw in in Danish. But then when you look at simple tenses, interestingly, what you usually get is, what you get sometimes in some dialects for some verbs, you get doubling, okay? Just like we saw with Polish, right? So in this case, from I go to the garden, you get go, particle, go to the garden, right? So doubling. Interestingly, like we saw before, when you get doubling, you get this pattern where the fronted verb is in a sort of unexpected bare infinitival form, and the verb that is left behind is that is further to the right, has the inflection that we would expect, which in this case is present first singular. But then actually what you get in most cases, right, is do support, something similar to English, in which when you front the verb, the fronted verb is in infinitival form, and then what's left behind is actually not a copy of that verb, but it is a verb, and is the verb do, and that verb has the expected inflection, in this case, the imperfective. Okay. Okay, so that was quite a bit, but I was sort of repeating the same thing for two different constructions. The important point is that we find this parallel that we see here, right? Which is that when we front VPs or when we front V's by long verb fronting, the spell of possibilities are the same. We either get just one verb in the fronted position, two verbs, one in the fronted position, and an additional one, and there are two copies of the same verb, or the verb in the fronted position and then do in the unfronted position. And also, interestingly, the spell of possibilities are the same even to inflectional detail, right? So normally, in particular, right, in simple verb fronting, the fronted verb, there's only one verb, and that bears the inflection that we'd expect it to bear. Under doubling, the fronted verb is in a default form, and they're both VP fronting and V fronting, and then the extra copy is in the expected inflected form, And we do support the fronted verb is an sort of an expected bare infinitival form, and then the unfronted verb is in the in this case do is in the expected finite inflected form. Okay. All right. So in the next few pages, I'm just going to show you how to do this. Okay. How do we account for this variation? All right. So the hypothesis is going to be that that V fronting in Breton, long head movement in Breton, is just like phrasal movement. So first, I'll show how it works for VP fronting, and it will work in the expected way, and then I'll just apply that to V fronting. Right. So right. So remember, so first we'll do the simplest case, which is simple fronting, right? Where there's no kind of doubling or do support or anything like that, right? So these typically involve compound tenses, and here you front the VP or you front just the verb, and that's it. And there's no doubling or anything like that. So the derivation goes like this. The idea is that move is a sort of a composite of three separate operations. When you move a constituent, first you make a copy of it. You take that copy to the higher position, you merge it in the higher position, and then you delete the lower copy. By deletion of the lower copy, I simply mean that it's marked in some way so that at the end of the derivation, at the end of the derivation, we make sure that it's not pronounced, that lower copy is not pronounced, right? So when we do VP fronting, VP starts at the complement of the auxiliary, right? We make a copy of it, right? So now there are two copies of the VP. These new copies merge in the higher position, in the fronted position. And as the last step of movement, we marked the lower copy of the VP for non-pronunciation, what I'm calling delete. Now, for simple V fronting is the same, except that what's moved is just the verb. Okay, not the whole VP, but just the verb, just the head of the VP. So it's the same thing. V starts at the head of VP. You make a copy of V. We merge that copy in the higher position. And then we mark the lower copy for deletion, for non-pronunciation. This is a pretty standard way of accounting for movement. There's no surprise here. Okay. All right. So now the more challenging, a more challenging task is to account for the doubling case. Remember, these are cases where in simple tenses where you front a VP, you get, maybe surprisingly, get two copies of the verb. In the fronted VP, the verb is in a sort of infinitival form. In the unfronted position, the verb has the expected finite form. So my analysis of this is there's a way in which it's not original, and there's a way in which it is highly original because it's based on a particular theory of head movement. So this is also going to be an introduction of what kind of operation I think head movement is. But the idea is this, that you get doubling because of the interaction of two movements. In addition to the fronting of the VP or the verb, right? There's a previous step of head movement in which the verb move out of the VP, say to T, or whatever it gets its inflection, right? And the same thing for V fronting. And we'll see that the reason why with V fronting you can also get doubling is the same, because prior to establishing this movement to affecting this movement operation of V to a high position in the clause, there was a previous step of V to T head movement. Okay. And as we'll see, because of the way these two movements interact, first head movement and then phrasal movement, the verb is going to be pronounced in two positions, right? In particular, one in the fronted position, but then in the other one in T. That is due to the prior step of head movement. Okay. All right. So the way this works is by first formalizing head movement as a distinct kind of operation from what we saw in the previous slide on the in joint work I've been doing with Asha Petrasco for a few years now. So first step in understanding, I'm sorry, I need to check if, can somebody tell me if you can hear me? Because I just got a message saying that my connection is unstable.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. All right. So first step in understanding what generalized head movement is and how it formalizes head movement is an idea due to Harley and ultimately also to Helen Kaiser that that we need to separate features on a head into its syntactic features and features that are morphological. That is, features that are responsible for the exponents, for the realization of that head. So for instance, in the case of T, we could say T has, say, a selectional feature, a categorical feature, but then it also has features that are responsible for its form, right? Things like past tense or first person singular subject agreement, right? So just for brevity and for simplicity, I'm going to abbreviate whenever we have a head X, I'm going to abbreviate its morphological features with mu sub X, right? So I'll represent a head like T as being like this. It's the head T, and then its morphological features are abbreviated as mu sub T. So the idea is that head movement, or what we call generalized head movement, relates the two heads not by movement, but by actually doing something with its mu's, with its mu features, morphological features, right? So in particular, the way V2T movement would work, for instance, in Polish, right? The way in 16 watch gets to form a word with the inflection, the past tense first singular inflection, is by relating V to T by generalized head movement. And this doesn't actually move V to T or T to V. It actually relates them in a more abstract way that puts their morphological features together to form what we can call a complex set, as in here. Okay. But what's important is that this complex object that we created by generalized head movement still has a connection to both nodes, to both V and T. Okay. So that's represented with the dashed lines here. So the idea is that the single complex set is associated with both terminals, here V and T. And one of the things that Ash and I have done in previous work is to show that it's a nice way of deriving why in some languages this complex set is spelled out high in T and in others in low in V. So for instance, it's spelled out high in T in Polish, but V famously in English, the relation between V and T is a complex set that is actually pronounced low. And we also assume that part of the definition of generalized head movement is that it's super local. It obeys the head movement constraint. How am I doing for time? Do I have like 20 minutes left?
I'm not sure it's my responsibility to tell you, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, about that.
Thank you. All right. So how does this derive doubling? Well, we just have to put together head movement and move as I did a couple of pages ago, right? So the idea is that we derive doubling by first doing a step of head movement and then VP fronting, right? In the case of VP fronting, right? So how do we derive something like in Polish, what's the game I watched, right? Well, the first step is head movement, relating V and T, right? So if the derivation stopped here, we would simply spell out this complex set that is the verb, the finite verb in T, right? But what's special about VP fronting sentence is that there is an additional step of fronting the VP, right? And as we said before, well, that's move, right? So first we create a copy of the VP. And what's crucial now is by copying the VP, we also created an extra copy of the complex set that has V and T in it, the morphological features of V and T. The important thing is that now there are two guys that look like that. Okay. And that's ultimately what's going to derive doubling. Okay. Now, this copy that we created is merged in the higher position, okay? And then remember the last step was to mark the lower copy for non-pronunciation, okay? But of course, because there was a previous step relating V and T, now the complex set is not only, this complex set is not only associated with the V that is marked for non-pronunciation, but also T that is outside the scope of non-pronunciation. So that's where that complex set is pronounced. And that's why we get two copies. It's just an automatic result of there being two copies of the complex set that were created by VP fronting. Okay. Now, one more step that we need is to account for why the two copies of the verb look different. Why the fronted verb has a sort of an expected infinitival form, and the copy that is not part of the fronting has the expected finite form. The idea is that if the morphological features of a head are not linked to that head, then the spell out of these features is defective. Okay. So in particular, if you look at the lower complex head, right, mu sub t, right, is linked to t, right? It's associated with t. But in the higher complex head, it's not, right? Because it was separated with t by VP fronting, right? So then that mu sub t is spelled out defectively, and that's why it surfaces as an infinitive. Okay. Of course, now the verb is linked to a V node in both copies of the complex set, and that's why you get two exact copies of the verb. Okay. All right. Now, with V fronting is the same, right? In Breton, we get doubling for the same reason that we get doubling with VP fronting in Polish, except that what moves is not the entire VP, but the verb, just the verb. But it's really the same derivation, right? So first we relate V and T by generalized head movement, creating the complex head. Then, because we're targeting just the verb for move, right? Just that is copied, again, creating two copies of the complex set. Then one of the copies of the verb, the extra copy of the verb is merged in the higher position. The lower copy of the verb is marked for non-pronunciation, but the complex set that is linked to that still survives because it's linked to T, right? And just like before, this will derive two copies of the verb. This one will have its normal expected finite form, but this one will, because it's not linked to a T, it will have a defective infinitable form. Right? So the upshot of this is the doubling in both, and they're both VP fronting and V fronting, or long verb movement in Breton. Doubling is the automatic result of the copy part of it, which can target either XP or X. And that's why V fronting or long head movement and VP fronting behave the same way, and they both direct doubling. So now what about do support? That was the final possibility for a spell out of both VP fronting and V fronting that we saw, right? And my idea is that this is really just a subcase of doubling. Okay, we think of do support as really just doubling of the verb, but with an additional quirk. Okay, so in order to see how there's similar, just look at that, right? They look very similar, except that under doubling, this verb is just a copy, the same as the fronted verb. But with do support, it's really, the structure looks the same, with the only difference being that in the unfronted position, we get do instead of a copy of the fronted verb. So our idea is that simply this do is a copy of the fronted verb, except that just like we saw for T before, it's spelled out defectively. It's just a defective pronunciation of the fronted verb, and that gets realized as do. Right. So so just to see the parallel, right, this is the way doubling works, right? Right, in the higher complex head, mu T has a defective spell out because it's not linked to a T. In the lower complex head, mu T is linked to a T, and that's why it has normal spell out, right? The idea is that what happens with do support is that just like mu t in the higher complex set, mu v in the lower complex set has a defective spellout. Okay, and it has a defective spellout ultimately for the same reason that mu t can have a defective spellout, and that is that it somehow lost its link to the place where it started, to v. Okay, so the idea is that simply this is a question of variation, right? The idea is that in some cases, a complex set is delinked from unpronounced nodes, right? So to give you an idea, this is roughly how we saw that VP, sort of the structure of the results from VP fronting, right? We have an initial step of generalized head movement relating V and T. Then we have fronting of the verb or the VP, right? Now, because of that fronting, the lower copy of the verb is marked for non-pronunciation. So what we're saying is that in some constructions, what happens is that this link between the complex set relating V and T and V, and in particular V because it's marked for non-pronunciation, it's severed, right? So that the result is this tree over here, right? So now what we see is that just like before in the higher head, mu T has lost its link with T, and that's why it's pronounced effectively. But now, also in the complex set, in the lower complex set, mu sub V has lost, just by stipulation, has lost its connection to a V, and that's why it's pronounced effectively, and that's why it's pronounced as do, right? And that's it. So here I show in parallel how to get do support with both VP fronting and with V fronting. But most importantly, one of the important parallels here is to contrast the doubling cases with the do support cases, because our claim is that the syntax is really the same. There's just an added step of delinking that leads to do support, right? So remember how V doubling worked, right? So we have first a step of generalized head movement relating V and T, then fronting of the VP, right? With V fronting is the same, except that what you front is V. We saw how that leads to doubling of the verb, right? In particular, because we have that copy of mu V in the two separate complex heads, right? And both complex heads are linked to V, right? Here and here. All right. So then by hypothesis, what happens in the cases of do support is that the syntax is the same. So for instance, if VP fronting in English, the VP is fronting. But now in the previous step that we related V and T, because of the VP fronting, the V is marked for non-pronunciation, and that in English leads to severing the link between the lower complex set and V. And now V is sort of motherless. It's lost its link to V, and that's why it receives a defective pronunciation as do. Then the claim is that with V fronting in Breton, you get do support for exactly the same reason, right? In Breton, just like in English, whenever a complex set with mu V is associated with a head that is marked for non-pronunciation, that link is severed, and that means that mu V will get a defective spellout as do. Okay, and now exactly how we get the variation is relatively simple, right? What we want to say is that in Polish, you never do this delinking, and that's why in Polish you always get verb doubling. In English, you always get this delinking, right? So all verbs lose this link all mu V's lose this link, and that's why you always get do support in English. And in Britain, only some verbs, actually most verbs lose this link, but some verbs can keep it, and that's why in Britain sometimes you get doubling as opposed to do support. Okay. Okay, so that's how you get the three spellout possibilities, both for VP fronting cross-linguistically and for B-fronting in Breton. So because they work the same way, and because they're both the result of movement, right? Or move. This is, of course, an argument that long head movement is not really head movement. It's like phrasal movement, that is, it's move, right? So that if we have this initial typology shown here, right, at the top of the page, between short head movement, long head movement, and phrasal movement, right? Short head movement moves X and is local. Long head movement moves X but is not local. Phrasal movement moves XP and is not local. Right? Again, by local I mean whether it obeys the head movement constraint or not. If we were trying to unify these movements, right, we could go in two different ways, right? We could, based on the target, on what moves, right, we could say, let's pay attention just to that. And locality doesn't matter, right? So let's just unify these two, right? Long head movement and short head movement, because what moves is the same kind of thing. And we'll keep phrasal movement apart, okay? Now, if what we cared about was about locality, while locality conditions are obeyed, actually we would go in a separate direction, right? We would keep head movement apart, like I did in this talk, and call it generalized head movement, and say that long head movement actually should be unified with move because they have the same locality conditions. That is, in particular, they're not subject to the head movement constraint. But now, what I showed in most of the talk is that long head movement is like phrasal movement, right? So what effect does that have on these ontologies that we created based on the two kinds of theories? Well, under a target-based ontology, right, which is here, once we say that that long head movement is the same as phrasal movement, what we're really saying is that all movements are the same kind of movement, okay? Under a locality-based ontology, which is what I've assumed here, right, we already said that a long head movement and phrasal movement is the same, right? So by giving a further argument that they are, we're still saying that generalized head movement, that head movement is different, that local head movement is different, right? So then what I'm going to do in the next section is show that that there are other arguments to keep short head movement and phrasal movement separate. So that there will be additional argument that short head movement is a different kind of operation, which is what I've been trying to argue all along. So there is actually, if you look in the literature, sometimes, often this is not stated this way, but there are several ways in which short head movement and phrasal movement differ beyond locality. First, it's well known that there are different interaction with ellipses having to do with identity conditions. Another one that Asha Pirtasco and I have argued for, and others have argued for, is that short head movement that is subject to the head movement constraint actually can be bidirectional. It can either go up the tree or down the tree. And then the one I want to concentrate on in the next section, in the last few minutes that I have of the talk, is that this important difference, other important difference between short head movement and phrasal movement is that the spell looks different, especially when we look at remnant movement configurations. So, right. So a locality-based ontology, which is the one that I've assumed, allows for these differences between short head movement and head movement, and it predicts that long head movement behaves like phrasal movement with respect to all of them. So that the parallels that I've discussed between long head movement and phrasal movement, that is, say, B-fronting in Breton versus B-fronting in other languages, are ultimately an argument for a locality-based ontology of movement operations. That is, for saying that head movement being subject to the head movement constraint is a different kind of operation for the other kinds of movements. All right. So, So here's the final argument, right? It has to do with what we see, sort of, interesting spell out possibilities in remnant movement configuration. So just a very short introduction to remnant movement, right? So remnant movement is a particular type of interaction between two movements. In particular, the first step involves moving an element X, shown here, out of a containing phrase Y, right? The second step involves taking that phrase Y and moving it to a higher position. Okay. All right. So this is in the abstract. And what's interesting is that depending on what kind of movement one is, depending on what kind of movement is done in the first step, the spell out of this X is different. So if movement one is head movement, short head movement, generalized head movement, X is spelled out twice. And that's what we saw several times in the talk today, right? The best example that I had of that was with Polish, right? Where when you do VP fronting, you pronounce the verb twice. And I already show you how that's done, right? And that relied on a difference between move and head movement. What's interesting is that if the first step in remnant movement is phrasal movement, the first thing that moves actually is only spelled out once. Okay. So an illustration of that, and this is actually typically the case for a remnant movement. An illustration of that is interaction between passive movement, right? Movement of the subject in passive out of the VP. In English, interaction with VP fronting. Okay, so the relevant example is 36A. Okay, but it needs some setup, some context. So it would be something like, I said that you'd be taken out to the prom, and taken out of the prom, you were. Okay. The important thing is that I will show on the next page. This involves two steps. First, passive movement of you out of the VP, and then fronting of the VP, right? Now, because of the way remnant movement works, we might expect this you to be pronounced twice, as in taking you out to the prom you were, which of course is crashingly bad. Okay, so we want to understand why that is not the case. But in any case, what's clear is that when in a remnant movement configuration, the first movement is phrasal movement, we don't get multiple copy spell out. But when that movement is head movement, we do. Okay, and that again is an argument that we should keep short head movement or local head movement as a separate operation from move or phrasal movement. All right, so in the last, sorry, I know I'm a little over time. So in the last 1 or 2 minutes, I just want to go over the derivation of remnant movement, where both of them are phrasal movements or move. Right, so the relevant example was taken out to the prom you were, right? This involves two steps, right? So first, because this is passive, we know that you, the subject, starts inside the VP, right? So it starts as something like, we're taking you out to the prom. Then you become the subject, you were taken out of the prom, right? Which is the sentence without VP fronting. And then you do VP fronting, okay? So the question is, given the theory of movement I was presenting before, phrasal movement, do we derive that only one copy of this U is going to be pronounced, and in particular this one? Okay, because the sentence is taken out of the prom, taken out to the prom you were. Okay, there's no, in particular, there is no extra copy of you here, like we find when the first movement is head movement. All right, and it really is to show that we derive exactly one copy of you. In particular, right, so the first step is the subject moving out of the VP. Remember how that works. The subject actually starts here. We make a copy of it, right? We merge the extra copy in the higher position, and we mark the lower copy for deletion. Okay, that step is important. The second step is fronting the VP. Okay, so again, that takes 3 steps. Copy the VP, merge the VP in the higher position, and delete the lower VP copy. The first step is the important one, because of the previous step of moving the DP out to TP to subject position, right? that lower DP copy has been marked for non-pronunciation. So then when we copy the VP to move it, right, we're actually copying something that contains an unpronounced copy of DP. Okay, so that copy of the VP is merged in the higher position. And then the lower copy of the VP is marked for deletion. The important thing is that there are lots of copies of the DP in this final tree. That one, and that one. But only this one is the one that is not deleted. It's not marked for non-pronunciation. The other two are marked for non-pronunciation, and that's why you only pronounce one copy. Okay, only the copying of the subject inspect DP is over. The important point is that however you derive this, right, what we have is the generalization I mentioned before here, which is that in remnant movement configurations, head movement, short head movement always leads to doubling or do support in some cases. But phrasal movement actually does not. You only have one copy, spell out of one copy, and that's completely expected. So it's completely expected, especially if local head movement is different, and the way its spell out is decided is very different from the way that phrasal movement or move is decided. So to conclude, and sorry, I'm a little over time. The main claim is that head movement is a syntactic operation, and in particular is distinct from other syntactic operations, and in particular distinct from other movement operations or move. And on the one hand, the hypothesis explains why long head movement behaves more like phrasal movement than like canonical head movement or short head movement. And it also explains why in remnant movement configurations, we have doubling or do support when head movement interacts with move, but not when only move is involved. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that we did start a bit late, so I think that we can still have 10 minutes for questions. I will be monitoring the chat. Otherwise, you can just raise your hand and I will be, yeah, you will be able to talk. I see that Irena has a question.
Hi, I'm Irena. I'm a student here. Thank you for the great talk. I really enjoyed it. I'll just start off with a basic question first. You mentioned the strict locality conditions earlier, and you explained how they're different here. So my question is, did you observe or looked into any, noticed any violations of these conditions, and under what conditions?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
If you have observed any violations of those conditions, the strict locality conditions.
I'm sorry, my sound is, I guess, not really good. I'm sorry. Yeah, can you type it? Sorry. Have you observed any violations of the locality conditions? You mean like the head movement constraining head movement? What do you mean if I have observed them? So, right, if you construct sentences that violate them, they're ungrammatical, right? So in English, from Sue will be eating fish, the only thing that you can front to the left of the subject is will, right? You cannot say be Sue will eating fish or eating Sue will be fish, right? Is that what you were asking? Of course, importantly, in long verb movement in Britain, that's violated all the time, and that's why it's not head movement.
Okay, before passing the floor to Scott, I have a request that I also would like to ask if you can share that handout in the chat, maybe that would be useful.
Oh, you want me to drop it in the chat?
If it's possible, or
of course.
at any time thank you.
Let me find it first. Let me find the file. Okay. Oh, I always forget. Yeah. I don't know why so complicated.
We can. I think that we can do it maybe in the student session and
Okay.
let Scott ask a
Okay,
question
yeah,
now.
go ahead, go ahead, Scott. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I appreciate how clear you made everything, even for those of us who aren't syntacticians. I had just one question. So you were talking about how, when a verb moves, that it has a defective spell out if it's marked for nominalization. And I was just wondering, what conditions would cause it to be marked for nominalization?
For non-pronunciation?
Oh, is that what you said? Non-pronunciation?
Yeah, sorry.
Wow.
Non-pronunciation. It's marked for non-pronunciation, for deletion.
Okay.
Basically, it's not going to be pronounced. Yeah, the idea is that, well, there are a couple of ideas here. So one is that movement is not simply moving something, but it's actually making a copy of it and I'm putting that copy in a different position, but then not pronouncing the original copy, right? The reason why this is done is that it gets you interesting things like the ones I showed today, right? That movement is this sort of complex thing of copying and deleting the original copy. But then actually another case in which you find something like that is marked for non-pronunciation is ellipsis. So another case where you get things like do support in English is under VP ellipsis, like John told me that he would watch a movie and he did, right? Where you're deleting watch a movie and you get this extra verb do. And in fact, you get it in a very similar way to the way I showed that you do it with VP fronting in English. And actually, Asha Pertasco and I have a paper on this. And anyway, but yeah, the idea is that certain things are marked for deletion either because they're moved or displaced or just because of ellipses.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
While we wait for possible other question, I do have a question about have you noticed any difference in maybe the interpretation when one strategy is chosen over another?
No, because no, but I haven't looked for one and I don't expect one. So this might be a case where, the answer is no, but yeah, I haven't really looked for one. I don't really expect one because there's well, first when you look at VP fronting, it's just that in some languages you have do support, in some languages you have doubling, and there's no room for different kinds of interpretation. It's interesting that in Breton, some verbs can do either, right? With most verbs, you get do support, but in some verbs, with some dialectal variation, you get either doubling or do. And although the literature is not very clear on this, I think some speakers can do either for particular verbs, and no interpretive difference has ever been reported. But I sort of don't expect there to be any. But that doesn't mean it's not there. So especially if nobody has looked for it, then who knows? But I've never, in the literature on Breton, I've never seen any report of this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that Nathaniel has a question.
It seems like the head movement in English is mostly reserved to narrative or literary settings and wouldn't be something you hear someone use in common speech. Oh, are you referring to VP fronting in English? Like, what's the movie I did? Right. No, you're right. So yeah, VP fronting is a little marked in English, but there are contexts that can make it sound natural, and that's what I tried to do in the last example I discussed. There are others that also sound a little formal, but maybe sound better, like with though, you know, what's the game though John said he would. He never did, right? Again, sounds a little marked. Befronting in Breton is actually very natural, and sometimes it's sort of like the best option. Right. There is this requirement that there be some clause initial element, especially matrix clauses. I think maybe only matrix clauses, and that can be the subject, but it can be any fronted thing, and it can also be a fronted verb. And as far as I know, they're not marked in any way. They're actually pretty natural everyday sentences in Britain.
Okay, we have a question by Ahmed.
Yep. Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for sharing this with us. It was really interesting. And I have a question regarding formalizing what you have. So I know that OT has been used to account for some syntactic operations and processes. Have you thought of formalizing the differences between short, long head movements and phrasal movements within a constraint-based theory? And is that something that can be done or not?
Thank you. It's an interesting question. I have not thought about this, because in general, I said don't do OT. But of course, it would be interesting to think whether doing this in OT would give you any insight, right? There's it depends on how exactly you would implement it. So I think there are aspects of my analysis that are difficult to translate into OT, especially because they involve a derivation. So it's important that the step that I showed that, for instance, in the remnant movement cases, one of the movements occurs before the other one, right? In an OT theories that are sort of very non-derivational, something like that, I think would be hard to implement, although who knows? But otherwise, I don't see why this should not be implementable using OT syntax, but it's not really something I thought deeply about. I'm not sure that there is, I see anything that is obviously output oriented, which is what you would hope in OT. So just you know, I've thought about this question for exactly 1 minute now. So right now I can't see anything any advantage that we will get from doing it in OT, but I also don't see any disadvantage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't think I see any other question. So maybe let's wait for 30 seconds, and then maybe we can ask the faculty to leave, and we can keep asking questions. And of course, as I said before, please, students, both syntactician and not, please stay on, because it's usually a nice conversation.